It began with the sound of timber cracking in a freeze so deep it made nails shrink out of cabin walls. The mountain was black with cold, and no one was sleeping. Not the dullards, whose roof had already buckled once. Not the Crawleys, whose 2 boys were coughing blood again. And certainly not the homesteaders huddled in their thick log cabins, shivering with 4 blankets and 3 layers, wondering why the cold this year cut through wood like paper. But someone wasn't cold, and that was the worst part. They could see the firelight every night, flickering from high up in the trees like a taunt. A warm, steady amber glow tucked into the pines near the south edge of the ravine. It stayed lit through blizzards, never flickered low, and the snow below it stayed melted in a near-perfect ring. Not once did they see a man chopping wood. Not once did they hear the groan of floorboards or the crash of roof ice. Just silence, warmth, the smell of smoked meat drifting faintly through the snow fog. The mountain man they'd laughed at all summer, he was the one up there. And now, while their children cried themselves to sleep with frostbitten feet, he slept high above the snow line, in a tree house they'd all mocked as fool's timber work. Let's go back to where that started. His name was Elias Mercer, and most folks assumed he was simple the first time they saw him. Not because he talked slow, he didn't talk at all. Not because he walked hunched or dumb. He stood tall, with arms like stacked firewood, but because he did things that didn't fit. He traded 2 muskrat pelts for a bundle of rope, then another for tin sheeting. He asked odd questions about wind current and temperature rise and sap levels in spruce. The Crawley boy said he saw Elias building something 20 feet in the air, just nailing raw boards into the crook of an old pine. No ladder, no plan, just 1 nail at a time with his boots hanging into nothing. They called him the Squirrel. A few called him worse. That fool thinks he can beat the mountain by climbing trees, Mrs. Dullard had said once, chuckling to the others as she wrung ice out of her shawl. That's not a home. That's a woodpecker's joke. Elias never answered. He just kept working, day by day, with no explanation. When he passed through town, if he passed through at all, he smelled like pine tar and earth and vanished again before anyone could pin a word to him. By October the leaves were gone, and Elias's treehouse shelter was complete, if you could call it that. No stairs, no porch, no woodpile, just a round pod tucked inside the thicket of pine boughs, reinforced with a strange crosshatch of tar paper, clay daub, and hand-cut shingles no one had seen him buy or trade for. But by the time the real cold came, it didn't matter how strange it looked, because it worked, and everyone else was freezing. The first death came early, a newborn in the Pearson cabin. Then, a frostbite amputation by the Crawleys. The doctor's stethoscope froze solid. The preacher stopped making visits past dusk. Even the oxen wouldn't leave their stalls. But Elias's shelter glowed. Maybe it's a trick, someone said. He's not really warm, it just looks it. So they watched. For hours, days, nothing changed. No smoke from the chimney, because he had none. No footprints below, because he didn't come down. But a soft glow came every night. No flicker, no struggle, no panic. And then the storm hit. Not a normal freeze. This one howled like God himself had turned on the mountain. Winds that threw snow sideways. Temperatures that cracked ceramic. The kind of freeze that made men cry because they couldn't feel their toes, and made women say prayers that barely left their lips before freezing solid. The Dullards tried to burn furniture. The Crawleys huddled in the root cellar and nearly suffocated. The Pearsons had to sleep in shifts, rotating between who held the fire and who slept nearest the coals. But Elias stayed lit, and it didn't go unnoticed. By the 3rd day of the storm, something in the town had shifted. People stopped calling him the Squirrel. They started saying maybe he knew something. By the 4th night, 2 boys tried to climb the ridge and reach his shelter. They made it halfway before the wind knocked them back down the snowfield, nearly freezing them to death. When the Crawley boy asked his pa, "Why's his place warmer?" his father didn't answer, but he was asking himself the same thing. The truth was, Elias hadn't built it for warmth. Not at first. He'd built it because he was afraid of people. No one knew about the scar under his shirt, the kind that ran from collarbone to hip. No one knew about the fire that burned his first family's cabin to ash. No one had been there in Kansas when Elias clawed out of the smoke-choked root cellar alone, his fingers burned to bone, dragging his little sister's quilt behind him because it was the only piece left unburned. He didn't build that shelter to be smart. He built it to disappear. But in doing so, he'd stumbled into something no settler had dared consider: elevation. The wind howled differently above the snow line. The cold settled down low, and the trees themselves, tightly packed in the ridgeline cleft, served as natural windbreaks. More than that, he insulated it from above, not below. Packed pine duff in every crevice, laid down a floor of woven branches, and sealed it in clay. He used the chimney heat principle in reverse, building a false roof above the actual ceiling, letting the heat stay trapped in a pocket of still air. The tree itself, alive and thick, absorbed and radiated subtle warmth from within the trunk, enough to fight the bitter edge of the night. It was primitive science, but it worked, and now those who mocked him were beginning to question everything they thought they knew about. Cold, heat, and pride. On the 7th day of the freeze, the dullard's roof collapsed again. This time the children were injured, not fatally but bad enough. The doctor couldn't make the trek. The horses were iced in. Even the snowshoes cracked when tried. There was only one person left who might survive a journey that night, and no one wanted to say it, except the youngest Crawley, who whispered it like a prayer. Ask the tree man. But would Elias answer? Would he even hear them? That night, they climbed the ridge. The cold fought them at every step. One man turned back. The others kept going. Lanterns clutched like last hopes, snow whipping across their faces until it felt like skin was splitting. At the top they didn't find a porch, no door, but a rope dropped down. No words, just the rope. And slowly, hand over hand, they climbed into the shelter they once mocked. And what they saw made them go quiet, because it wasn't just warm, it was hot. Steam rose gently from a central pit where coals smoldered beneath clay. The walls were tightly sealed, lined with furs and moss. The air barely moved. No drafts, no creaks. Just heat, quiet, constant heat. Elias stood at the far side, shirtless, wiping sweat from his brow with the same quilt he'd carried all those years ago from Kansas. And for the first time since the freeze began, someone smiled. Not because they were happy, but because they were alive. And for now that was enough. There were 7 of them, inside by dawn. 7 frozen settlers who hadn't come with plans or pride or prepared words, only desperation. Some brought their children. Some carried nothing but frostbitten hands. One woman had wrapped her infant in torn curtains soaked in old stew broth, praying the heat from her own chest might carry through. It didn't. She cried quietly when Elias handed her a dry fur and pointed toward the far corner of the tree shelter, where the warmth pooled deepest near the roofline. No one spoke at first, not because there wasn't anything to say, but because to speak meant to admit what they were feeling. They were inside a structure they'd called foolish, strange, even dangerous, and now it had saved them in the very hour when their own roofs gave out. Elias barely looked at them. He didn't smile, didn't ask questions. He only moved silently, his steps practiced, careful not to jostle the floor too hard or let too much heat out at once. He replenished the insulated coals in the pit using a clay chimney stopper system that sat underneath a removable panel. It was unlike anything they'd seen. He didn't use a regular stove or even a typical hearth. Instead, a clay-lined core beneath the floor radiated slow, even warmth upward through the planked base and into the shelter's belly. The logs were hollowed, notched, fitted with moss and tar from sap he'd boiled down through the summer. The entire shelter was more than wood. It was a kind of forest lung. The heat stayed, the air filtered, the roof dripped from steam instead of snowmelt, and despite the trees groaning all around them in the whipping dawn wind, the interior held like a womb. Mrs. Dullard broke the silence first. Her voice cracked. "How'd you think to do this?" Elias didn't answer. He didn't have to, because the real answer was sitting just behind him, tucked into a carved niche above his own bedding. The blackened remains of a child's boot, scorched at the edge, melted halfway through at the heel. The kind of thing only a man who'd seen children burn to death in their own home would keep. A reminder, a warning, a vow never to let it happen again. "Built it wrong the first time," was all he said. They understood. The news spread slow, because no one could get down the ridge for 2 more days. The storm held. One settler after another arrived at the tree shelter, pale and hollow-eyed, carrying whatever they could drag. Not all were accepted in. Elias knew the limits. Too much weight on the platform could shear it clean off the pines. So he took the worst cases first. The sickest, the children, the wounded. He directed the others to dig wind pits below, makeshift trenches in the snow against the lower trunk base, which he'd insulated with woven pine matting and rock walls. These weren't as warm, but they shielded bodies from wind, gave the men time to catch breath and thaw digits. No one questioned his orders now. No one laughed when he pointed and gave instructions with his jaw tight, because he was the only one who seemed to understand what was happening. Not just the cold, but the way it moved, pooled and seeped. Elias knew it like a hunter knows an animal's trail, and he was tracking this freeze like it had a mind of its own. By the 4th day, with settlers sleeping beneath and above, the tree shelter began to resemble a command post. Elias rationed everything: pine duff, fire time, steam melts. He taught a few boys to seal their boots with tree resin and linen, showed a mother how to make a wrap from 2 boiled pelt ends, that would keep an infant's chest 30 degrees warmer. And still, he never smiled, never seemed relieved. He only watched the sky, watched the trees' sways, listened to the moan of the wind, the way it echoed differently on each day, as if reading a language only he could hear. Because Elias knew this freeze wasn't done. It had another edge, and when it came, it would come fast. The first sign was the birds. A full day before the freeze snapped its worst edge, Elias climbed to the upper crow's perch of his tree shelter. He always watched the horizon twice a day. This time he saw nothing. No movement, no flutter, no crows, no chickadees, no hawks gliding in the thermals, just silence. Then came the second sign. The melt paused. The snow beneath the shelter, which had formed a soft puddle ring from the radiant heat, suddenly stopped dripping. Elias stepped, barefoot to the edge, squatted, and ran 2 fingers across the outer bark. It had gone rigid, brittle. He looked up. The sky was the wrong color. Not gray, not blue, green. A pale, sickly green that settlers in the mountains knew only as one thing: blight freeze. The kind of atmospheric collapse that dropped temperatures 60 degrees in hours. It happened when cold layers inverted and fell. Most didn't survive those nights, not even animals. He climbed down to the trench dwellers. "Tonight," he said, "you dig deeper. 2 feet, no less. Stuff the walls. Pack them. Sit on your hands if you have to. Don't breathe fast. Don't talk unless it's to pray." They didn't ask why. They saw it in his face, saw the burn of the past rising in his jawline, the glint of a man who'd lost too much already and wasn't about to let this mountain take another soul if he could stop it. In the tree shelter above, he pulled the fire pit core and refitted the clay stopper with a double insulation layer he'd kept wrapped in linen for years, waiting for this. He pressed the boot, the burnt one, into the wall cavity by his bed. Then he waited. The third freeze hit after dusk. The sound it made was indescribable. Not a scream, not a howl, but a shatter. Trees cracked from within. Sap froze mid-root, snapping trunks in half with a noise like rifles. Entire limbs fell from the forest canopy like dying arms. The river froze in place mid-flow, trapping mist above it into glass. Settlers down in the trenches covered their mouths with cloth. The children didn't cry, not because they weren't cold, but because they'd stopped having the strength to. The youngest clutched scraps of fur and hummed songs they barely remembered. Above, Elias sat cross-legged in his shelter, eyes closed. He didn't move for 6 hours. He barely blinked, just breathed slow, listened. When the storm's peak hit, he leaned over, reached into the clay pit, and lifted out a small iron dish wrapped in linen and pitch. He unwrapped it with care, revealing a folded set of parchment-like sheets, paper brittle from age. They were covered in smudged ink drawings, rudimentary thermal diagrams, airflow arrows, notes scribbled in charcoal. It had been her plan, his little sister's, before the fire, before the loss, before he ran into the wilderness. She'd drawn them by lantern light, thinking she could build a better warm house. She was 10. He hadn't understood them back then, but he kept them, carried them, built this place in her memory, not because he thought it would work, but because she'd believed it would, and it did. That night, as temperatures plunged deeper than anyone thought survivable, Elias's tree shelter held at 38 degrees. The trenches below dipped to 10 degrees, but none froze. 3 children entered that night with purple fingers. They woke up with color returning. One infant had stopped breathing. She revived after 2 hours near the clay core warmth. No one died, and the mountain, after one final howl, fell silent. The freeze broke with no warning, but Elias had already known it would, because cold doesn't vanish, it just recedes, and the next time it comes back worse, unless you learn, unless you change, unless you build a home in the sky. In the forest lungs, where the warmth hides not in fire but in memory. In the spring, the settlers rebuilt differently. They didn't use the old flat cabins. They asked questions, learned, and one by one, a strange sight filled the ridgelines. Rope ladders leading into the trees, clay stopper heating cores dug into lifted perches, moss-packed trunks, pine duff beds. They called them sky homes. They called them Eliases. But the man himself didn't stay. He packed the burnt boot, the parchments, the core stones, and vanished, just like he'd come. But the warmth stayed, the knowledge spread, and no one ever laughed again. Not at the man who built high in the trees, not when he'd shown them what true shelter looked like. The mountain thawed slow, as if reluctant to admit it had ever let warmth in. Snowmelt bled down the hillsides in stubborn trickles, hesitant to commit. Ice split like bark under midday sun, but the night still bit with enough teeth to kill an old man if he nodded off outside. The trees, silent and still bowed under weight night that had lasted too long, groaned like sleepers waking from a bad dream. And still, Elias was gone. No trail, no prints. No one had seen him pack, no goodbyes. The fire pit in the tree shelter had been cold when Crawley checked it, his breath fogging the still air as he lifted the clay lid and felt the dead coals. The boot, the scorched one, was gone. So were the sheets of parchment. Only the walls remained, and the quiet warmth in the planks, like something lingering long after its source had vanished. For a while no one knew what to say. They'd all lived. That part was clear. Not everyone had fingers. Some lost toes. One child never fully came out of the freeze right. She blinked slow, spoke slower, never again laughed the way she used to. But they lived, and more than that, they understood now. Understood the heat didn't just rise from fire. It rose from what you knew. Or didn't, from what you were willing to see, even if it didn't fit what the others believed. By April, the first tree shelter imitation had gone up. It was the Crawleys. They had the most mouths to feed and the least solid cabin left. No one helped at first, partly out of pride, partly out of ignorance. They saw Jeb Crawley high in the pines with a rope cinched around his waist, trying to nail shingle pieces into forked limbs, while his wife below stirred snow-warmed mush in a cracked tin pot. It looked foolish, shaky, like something a desperate man did before he gave up and froze to death. But Jeb didn't freeze. He didn't even look cold. The second imitation was better. That was the Dullards. And this time, others helped. Mr. Dullard admitted, without being prompted, that he'd once said Elias had squirrel sickness, but now he figured the man was onto something he'd never learned in all his 63 winters. By the time the fourth structure went up, a two-tiered platform with chimneyless heat pockets lined with scorched clay, the tone had changed completely. Men came with questions. Women took notes. Boys begged to carry bundles just to see how the floor was made. It wasn't worship. It wasn't even reverence. It was shame. Useful shame. The kind that makes a man gut his cabin and try again. The kind that makes a mother unlace her daughter's boots and stitch new ones with resin wrap because she remembered how Elias had shown her, wordlessly, with rough hands and gestures that stayed burned into her mind. They started calling it the Sky Style, but no one pretended it was theirs. They all said the name now like something half swallowed in guilt. Elias's Way. That summer the first formal gathering was held, not in a church. Theirs had burned after the storm, the old stovepipe having frozen, cracked, and finally spilled flame when the thaw moved too fast. Not in a barn. The surviving one was still being used to house 5 families without homes. But in the trees, literally, the Crawleys hosted it, if hosting was the word. They'd expanded their tree shelter by 3 limbs and 2 platforms. Their boys had hollowed out a section beneath the center spine for what Jeb called air holding, an idea he admitted he'd copied from watching Elias adjust his tar layers before the last storm. When folks gathered, the platforms held firm. The wind passed over, not through. A gentle warmth still rose from the central pit, lined with the same reddish stones Elias had used, the ones that didn't crack from thermal stress. 53 settlers attended, and every one of them came with something to share. A new insulation mix made from boiled bark and flour paste, a tree-drying technique that let you brace a wall without cutting it free, a crossbeam trick to stop sway in high winds. No one claimed invention. They all said, Elias did it first. Someone finally asked the question everyone had been holding. Where'd he go? No one answered at first. Then little Elsie, the Crawley girl whose lungs had nearly frozen, whispered the quietest theory yet spoken. Maybe he just came to show us? The words weren't meant to matter, but they did. That fall, a rider from across the valley arrived, not a settler, but a trapper, soaked in pine sap and snowmelt, with a rifle twice his size and a gaze that had seen worse storms than anyone present. He didn't ask for food, he didn't ask for shelter, just stood at the edge of the timberline, watching the glowing tree homes flicker in the dusk. Don't suppose this is Crawley land? He asked, voice low. Jeb nodded. Part of it, the trapper nodded toward the highest platform. Man came through my pass last spring, said he needed old limestone, paid for it with hand-woven rope, braided tighter than any I ever seen, asked if I'd seen any high-wood clay pools on the other ridge, spoke soft, carried a burnt boot wrapped in fur like it was gold. The trapper squinted. Sound familiar? Jeb stepped forward. Elias? Trapper shrugged. Didn't say his name, didn't need to. I asked where he was headed. He pointed south, said cold never hits the same place twice, said others were coming. Others? Other storms, other settlers, ones that laugh first and freeze later. That night they held silence again, not for death, but for something deeper, a kind of understanding no preacher had ever taught them, a lesson no book had written down, that sometimes the man who doesn't speak teaches the most, that sometimes warmth starts in the mind long before it ever reaches the fire pit. 2 years passed. The ridge changed. Cabins were still built, but none were flat-roofed anymore. Ground homes were fewer. Those that remained used double floors, wind channels, sun traps made from angled rock and glass. But most chose the trees, not high, just enough. Enough to breathe warm air instead of cold drafts, enough to keep the frost line below their beds. Children born in the spring didn't see tree homes as odd. They called them nests, said the sky people lived better. And it was true. No one had frozen since the Elias winter. No roofs had caved, no children had died from cold. And when the next hard freeze came, not as bad but mean enough, every family stayed inside, lights aglow, warm. In the morning they walked out and said, almost in unison, we were ready, not because they had better tools, but because they'd stopped laughing. They'd started listening. Then came the letter, folded in thirds, no signature, left at the base of the Crawley tree home, pinned with a carved stick that had been shaped into a perfect triangle. The same triangle Elias used to mark windflow points on his walls. It read, if you teach them, they'll live. If they listen, they'll build. If they build, they'll survive. If they survive, they'll help the next ones. That's all I ever wanted. Don't look for me, look for the cold. It always speaks first. And tell her, the little one, I heard her singing, and it reached me. No one asked who her was. Everyone already knew. Elsie, now 5, slept high in the treetop every night without a blanket, humming to herself as the radiant clay heat rose around her. The same hum she'd sung in that pit when the storm had made her voice crack and her lips blue. She never once caught cold again, and when asked why she always sang to the trees before sleep, she just shrugged and said, he's still listening, and maybe he was. Some say he went south, some say he built shelters for other forgotten towns. Some say he was never real to begin with, just a tale the freeze left behind to remind people how not to die stupid. But the warmth was real, the shelters were real, the lives still alive were real, and in every pine-built platform high above the snow, with walls of moss and a single clay heat core tucked in beneath, Elias Mercer still lived, not in body, but in every nail driven upwards, every child kept warm, every settler who finally chose to rise above the ground and learn. The valley had changed, but the mountains were always slower to admit anything permanent. Trees grew back crooked after storms. Snow still came earlier some years and stayed longer others. And settlers, even the ones who'd lived through the Elias freeze, still argued over stupid things. Who owned what woodline? Which mule team deserved blame for a broken wagon trail? Whether moon phases affected birth rates, but none of them ever mocked tree shelters again, not one. The memory of that winter sat in their bones. No one called them tree houses anymore. That word was gone, too childish, too small for what they'd become. They were sky shelters now, elevated homes built not for whim or curiosity, but for survival. Some families went higher, some built closer to the ridgeline windbreak. A few even experimented with multi-tiered support beams, blending roots and boughs into complex vertical villages. What they all shared was insulation, the pine duff and moss and clay Elias had taught them to trust. What they shared even more was quiet. They didn't speak of the freeze often, not because they'd forgotten, but because they hadn't. The cold had taken things they'd never get back, trust in their old ways, faith in what they'd once believed was strong timber and stronger pride. That winter had peeled the bark off their pretensions and left behind a truth no sermon could carve, that the mountain didn't care what they thought was normal, it only cared whether they learned fast enough not to die. So when the second letter came, again unsigned, again pinned with a carved triangle stick, they listened. 2 valleys east, 40 cabins, 5 stoves, no firestone. Snows early, cold is loud. If you know how to build, go. They won't believe you, but neither did you. There was no vote, no town meeting, just a quiet knocking on doors after dark. By morning, 6 men and 1 woman had gathered with packs ready. They brought clay molds, old parchments, even the layered sketches Elias had drawn into the beams of the Crawley platform before he vanished, cut directly from the wood and preserved like sacred texts. It wasn't about being heroes, it was about debt, unpaid, still heavy, owed not just to Elias but to the children who'd lived and the ones still to come. They didn't go to prove anything. They went because someone had done the same for them, and they couldn't sit in warmth knowing others were still blind to the cold's true face. The valley 2 ridges east was called Costa Hollow. It sat lower, wider, with wind sweeping from the east like a steady blade. 47 cabins by rough count, most of them clapboard, almost all with stone chimneys. The people there were proud, loud, and suspicious. When the 7 from Elias's Ridge arrived, they were met with rifles and hard stares. What do you mean, sky homes? You build in the trees? Hell kind of joke is that? The settlers from Elias's place didn't argue, didn't try to convert. They just built, took the leanest pine line they could find, and started raising beams. They didn't explain themselves, didn't invite gawkers, just measured, lashed, daubed, insulated, and by the 4th day, had a three-person shelter glowing warm while the rest of Costa Hollow still chopped and stacked wood like the freeze would wait its turn. It didn't. The wind changed on the fifth night, and by morning the snow came. Early, violent, no warning from the sky, just a drop so sharp it cracked windows and split saplings before noon. The people in the tree shelter didn't flinch. The ones who had laughed came knocking, just like before. Only this time the settlers from Elias's Ridge didn't close the trapdoor. They opened it and gave instructions. Your walls are hollow. Insulate with bark paste. Stack the fire rocks under, not in, your floor. Use pine duff, not hay. Hay breathes. Hay sweats. Hay freezes, one man in Costa Hollow argued. Said clay was a waste of time. Said the trees weren't meant for building. His wife ignored him. By nightfall, she'd sealed a shelter with her own hands and dragged her children inside while he sat sullen in the chimney corner, watching frost creep across the walls. When spring came, she left him, built her own platform 3 trees higher. No one called her foolish again. Back in Elias's Ridge, time moved differently. Years passed. Children who had been saved were now young adults. Elsie Crawley, once the little girl with frost-burned lips, had grown into a tall, sharp-eyed woman who never wore shoes inside the shelter. Said she liked to feel if the floor was losing heat. She was the first to invent the twin flue system, where smoke could be rerouted horizontally before exiting, warming more clay surface on its path. She didn't name it, but others called it Elsie's breath. She also started drawing. At first it was just diagrams, then sketches, then teaching. By the time she turned 16, she'd already written 50 illustrated pages on how to build an elevated shelter from nothing but what the mountain gave you. She stitched them into a leather-bound volume, sealed the cover with resin, and left it at the Valley Crossroads post with a note for the next ones. It was copied 17 times, circulated across 3 counties. Some treated it like gospel, some like rumor, but all of them remembered the first name in the first line. Inspired by Elias Mercer. No one saw him again. A freeze here, a fire there, a family who refused to listen. Another who remembered the story just in time to build. Sky shelters spread like quiet rebellion. Not official, not sanctioned, not law, but learned, earned, grown from the hands of those who once mocked and then survived, who passed the heat not through firewood, but through memory. And somewhere in those mountains, high above the tree line, beyond where roads go and voices carry, an old man still listens, or so they say. And sometimes when the wind cuts sharper than it should, and the sky turns sickly green before snow falls, the children stop and tilt their ears to the east, and they swear, every one of them, they hear humming, low, steady, like a song meant for the trees, like a man who never wanted to be known, only heard. Years passed, valleys changed, but the freeze always came, not every winter. Sometimes it skipped one, sometimes 2, but when it returned, it was never the same. Some years it crept quiet, like a hunter in the brush. Other years it roared in, snapping limbs and collapsing barns. It never came twice the same way, but it always came. And now, there were those who were ready, the ones who had listened, the ones who remembered. By the 3rd generation, the sky style had become something more than shelter. It was culture, no longer whispered, no longer mocked, no longer called foolish by men too proud to admit they'd once frozen in their pride. It was taught in every child's lessons. Boys and girls both learned how to lash a platform frame. Every teen took part in a wind test before building their own shelter ring. A child's 12th birthday was marked by a rite, sleeping alone for one night in the upper platform, with only coals and pine duff to warm them. It was tradition, it was strength, and it was all because of one man. Elias Mercer was no longer a name to most. He was a figure, a whisper, a shape in old tales. But for those who'd lived through that first freeze, he remained a wound that had healed into something hard and right, not scarred by tragedy, but sealed with respect. And the children still asked, did he really build it by himself? Did he really survive without fire? Did he really just vanish? Yes, yes, and yes, but not without leaving something behind, because his warmth had spread in ways no one expected. It began in an abandoned mining town, old place, half collapsed. Most folks didn't even know it was there. Tucked deep in a hollow between 2 ridges, no one crossed anymore because the bridge had given way in a spring thaw 2 decades earlier. The trail in was nothing but moss and regret. But one day a trader came through, skin cracked, mule half-starved, bags light. He had planned to camp on the ridge and make it out the next day, but a cold snap took him by surprise. Snow came fast, and he followed the ridgeline blindly looking for shelter. That's when he saw the rope ladder hanging from a pine 20 feet up. He climbed, desperate. Inside he found a shelter, not warm yet, not lit, but sealed, tight, dry. And in the center, laid carefully on a stone shelf, was a clay-wrapped bundle. Inside, coals, still faintly warm, and under the shelf, scratched into the pine floor. Not everyone laughs first, the trader lived, and when he told the story, no one doubted it, because others had begun to find them too. Hidden tree shelters, perched on ridges where no homes stood, always stocked with pine duff, always dry, always with some trick of warmth left behind. A shaped clay pot, a char-marked airflow channel, a moss-lined sleeping trench, just deep enough to keep a child alive through one night's worst edge. They called them Elias shelters, and no one dared move them, not even to claim the wood, because the rule had become unspoken and universal across the high country. You never tear down a sky shelter. You don't know who built it or why, but someday, someone's going to need it, and if they do, it'll be there, just like the first one had been. The Crawley family's old platform stood longer than any house in the valley. It was rebuilt 3 times, expanded twice. Elsie grew up, taught, passed on what she learned, and by the time her hair had grayed and her fingers curled with age, she was the elder now, the one children sat beside to hear about the man who built in the trees. They always listened, never giggled, because the story wasn't funny anymore. It was theirs. And when Elsie died, quietly, in her sleep, wrapped in a quilt next to a slow-burning clay pit, they didn't bury her in the ground. They placed her ashes in a firestone urn and hung it from the rafters of the highest platform, where the wind could carry the warmth. Elsewhere, other valleys learned, some from visitors, some from books, some from a story carried on a cold wind that froze one town solid, while the next, just over the ridge, sat in quiet warmth inside tree homes they'd once thought ridiculous. It was never about the wood, or the elevation, or even the design. It was about humility, about listening before mocking, building before breaking, surviving before it's too late. And slowly across the frontier, the sky style spread, sometimes called Elias work, sometimes called forest heat, sometimes just called sense, but always respected, always passed down, never claimed, because the one who had every right to put his name on it never did. The last letter came during a spring melt, pinned to a trunk with a triangle stick, near a small town that hadn't frozen in 3 winters. If they mock you, build anyway. If they doubt, show them warmth. If they freeze, open the door. If they live, disappear. If they build, you've done enough. No man needs credit for saving lives. Just quiet. Signed only, E. And now, every ridge holds at least 1, sometimes 3, hidden tree shelters, built in silence, left for strangers, because the warmth keeps spreading, not in flame, but in choice. And somewhere, maybe, there's still a man, grey now, quiet still, who climbs at dusk into his own shelter, coals low, wind rattling the canopy, and lies back listening to the wind, not for danger, but for something better, a song, a hum, a child's voice far away, warm, safe, laughing into the rafters. And in that sound he smiles, because he knows they're listening now, they've stopped laughing, they're building, and they'll survive, because they remember.